I'm afraid that the honest truth is that Muslim lives and Arab lives, Palestinian lives, simply do not matter. That it's gone from the fringes now very much into the mainstream of political discourse, and Muslims are now the target in the way that Jews were in the 1930s and the 1940s in Europe. Said that migrants and particularly Muslims were a fifth column here to kill us. And give him another 5 years with that platform and he could well end up being the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. That abuse would range from death threats to me, rape threats against my wife, death threats against my entire family. All of these parties are driven by anti-Muslim hatred. And you will have people say, well, we don't want that type of refugee or migrant coming here, even though of course we bomb their countries. When you think about Afghanistan or Iraq, or indeed supply arms to Israel.
As the first Muslim leader of a Western nation, Humza Yousaf made history in 2023 when he became First Minister of Scotland. Since then, the far right made rapid gains in Europe, Islamophobia is at a record high in Britain, and the Gaza ceasefire is in shatters. Now, whilst he's no longer the leader of Scotland, he's been at the forefront of opposing Israel's war on Gaza and calling out far-right racism. I sat down with him at the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, where he didn't hold back on his views on Western hypocrisy, America under Donald Trump, and the possibility of a far-right British Prime Minister. Humza Yousaf, firstly, thanks for joining us. You made history as the first Muslim leader of any Western nation. Can you tell us a bit about all the barriers that you had to go through to reach that position, especially being Muslim?
So it was a matter of really immense pride. It was also a really difficult challenge. So I suppose the message really is that you've got to put in the really hard graft. And also, once you're there, my advice to people is a fewfold. One, don't ever think you are not good enough. People will spend their life telling you that you're the wrong colour, the wrong religion, the wrong height, the wrong gender. They'll give you 101 reasons why you shouldn't go for it. But you should if you are in it for the right reason. And I suppose that's the second bit of advice I would give is look, if you keep your intention clean, which for me was to serve the public, not the other way around, then actually you should absolutely throw yourself into politics. But look, truthfully, you'll face barriers, and the world that we live in at the moment, those barriers, as I say, could be because of your age, your gender, your faith, your race. But have faith in your resilience to overcome them.
Did you face any specific barriers because of your Muslim faith?
Any cursory glance at my social media would show you just, I'm afraid, a plethora of racist, Islamophobic abuse. That abuse would range from death threats to me, rape threats against my wife, death threats against my entire family. I mean, it's the point where I have to have really difficult conversations with, my stepdaughter, who was then 14. Saying to her, look, this is what you need to be alert. You need to watch out if somebody's following you. We'll see about getting you a panic alarm. These are horrible conversations to have with a 14-year-old child. So yeah, plenty of barriers in the way, but also I'm always reminded, for all the kind of negativity and the abuse and harassment, the voices of good far outweigh the voices of bad.
I mean, you've been warning of the rise of Islamophobia for quite some time now. We saw even here, in Aberdeen Mosque, there was an attack. We've seen that, anti-Muslim hate crimes have risen sharply. How worried are you about Islamophobia in Britain?
Massively worried, not just about the rise of anti-Muslim hatred of Islamophobia in the UK, but right across most of the Western world, Europe, the United States, and as I say, across the Western world. And I've been warning about it for decades because it's been very obvious what's been happening. We have people who were once on the fringes of society, marginalised figures, people like Geert Wilders, movements like the National Front in France, people like Nigel Farage, all these people who over the years have immersed themselves in Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. Nigel Farage started the general election campaign with a dog whistle saying that British Muslims don't align with our values.
Yeah, exactly.
With British values, don't share British values. Geert Wilders, who once called for mosques and the Quran to be banned. The National Front in France, who one of their leaders, the candidate to be Prime Minister, in fact, at the last elections, associated with a movement that held pork and wine parties in Muslim neighbourhoods. These people are now either ahead in the polls, leading the polls, or in the case of Geert Wilders, his party, in fact, the leading party and the Dutch government. And all of these parties are driven by anti-Muslim hatred. And I'm afraid the problem is that it's gone from the fringes now very much into the mainstream of political discourse. And Muslims are now the target in the way that Jews were in the 1930s and the 1940s in Europe.
Speaking about that, a YouGov survey found that a quarter of Brits would vote for Reform UK. How likely is it that Nigel Farage could be the next Prime Minister of Britain?
I don't know a single political commentator that would bet against it. Not a single political commentator that would bet against it. At the very least, that he becomes leader of the opposition, and give him another 5 years with that platform, and he could well end up being the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So Nigel Farage, a man who started the general election with a dog whistle at Muslims, said that migrants and particularly Muslims were a fifth column here to kill us, whose party is riddled with people, candidates, elected members, who've not just dabbled in Islamophobia, but are immersed in anti-Muslim hatred, could be at the very least the leader of the next opposition, if not Prime Minister in 5 to 10 years' time. It is mind-boggling and worrying at the same time.
How does that make you feel?
Well, it certainly makes me feel unsafe, and I suspect makes most Muslims question whether their future can possibly be in this country. I mean, how can we possibly live under a leader of the opposition, a Prime Minister maybe in the future, that thinks that we are here to kill the rest of the population, that believes that Islam is an inherently violent religion, that has blown virtually every dog whistle about Muslims over the decades that you can possibly imagine.
Yeah, some of those criticisms in recent months and days has been about Pakistani grooming gangs, about Sharia law taking over the West and over the country. What did you make of these claims? How much truth is there to these claims?
Well, look, every single one of us, and I say this as a father of 3 girls, will speak out loudly, clearly, unequivocally against any sexual exploitation of children, and indeed condemn those, whether they're Pakistani or not Pakistani, whether they're white, black, or any ethnicity or nationality. No equivocation. Those people who have committed such disgraceful and disgusting crimes, I hope they never see the outside of a jail cell, to be frank. That being said, it is astonishing that those who rail against grooming gangs from one ethnicity were deadly silent when, for example, in Scotland, there was a grooming sex gang that was convicted just a couple of months ago. And of course, they were all white, not Pakistani background, not black, not ethnic minorities. And said, not a word from reform, indeed reform in Scotland or reform across the United Kingdom. So they're very selective in picking out what suits their agenda, and we should just call it out for what it is, and reform is a party that is steeped in Islamophobia.
What do you see as the greatest threat facing Britain today?
Well, for me, the greatest threat facing liberal Western democracies, including the United Kingdom, is a rise in the far right. Because what you have is when the far right gets a grip into power, let's not forget that while Muslims may be the first target, they will certainly not be the last. But also, of course, the far right has incredibly authoritarian tendencies. We can see that through far right movements that have managed to get into government, or those who are sympathetic to far right movements once they get into power, that they become more and more authoritarian. So the biggest threat, in my view, to Western liberal democracy right now is the exponential rise of the far right.
What can we do about it?
Well, it's pretty simple, actually. What you have to do, and this will take some time, because I'm afraid the far right rhetoric has been adopted and mainstreamed over a course of at least 2 decades by UK and Western politicians. What we have to do is confront it. Let's just take the issue of migration, one of the hottest topics in the country. And of course, there's not a sensible person out there that believes there should be uncontrolled, limitless migration. Yet we are a country and a continent that has a serious demographic problem with an aging demographic. We have a huge labour shortage, estimated to be over 40 million across the European continent by 2050, 7 million alone in Germany. So we're a country and a continent that requires migration for our economic prosperity, yet we've made migration one of the most divisive and toxic issues to be discussed in this country and openly created policy that makes it harder for migrants to come to this country and for us to upskill them. So, look, the dangers are numerous to not just democracy itself, but the economic prosperity of the continent as a whole.
Yeah, do you think that sentiment is against immigrants, or is that actually just a veil and it's really against Muslims coming into the country?
It's definitely about the wrong type of immigrant. And let's just take the issue of Ukraine. I was very proud to be part of the Scottish government that opened its arms and its home and their homes to the people of Ukraine. People of Ukraine who were innocent in against the Russian aggression that they faced. And they needed a place of sanctuary. And I'm very proud of the fact that so many countries, including my own, stepped up. And we've had thousands of Ukrainian refugees making their home here in Scotland. They should be welcomed here for as long as they want to be here. Now compare that to what our approach is to, you could take any number of countries. Gaza is one of the most obvious. People of Palestine. You could look at Afghanistan and Iraq, and you will have people say, well, we don't want that type of refugee or migrant coming here, even though, of course, we bombed their countries. You think about Afghanistan or Iraq, or indeed supply arms to Israel, who are causing such devastation in Gaza. So it is only the wrong type of migrant. So I think you're right. Look, a lot of this anti-migrant rhetoric is a veil for anti-Muslim hatred, but not just anti-Muslim hatred. I think almost person of colour is very blatantly now a racist trope for many people.
Turning to Gaza, the ceasefires and shatters. Israel this week's killed 400 people at least already. You also have family there, and you've described it as hell on earth. We've heard this argument a lot from Israel that Hamas is to blame. They're targeting Hamas, but it's killed 50,000 people, mostly women and children. Many human rights groups are calling it a genocide. The ICC has issued arrest warrants for its leaders. Can anyone really take Israeli arguments and propaganda seriously anymore?
So what I have noticed is the world seems to be waking up. We had protests week after week after week in the biggest capitals in the world. We've had witness scenes that I never thought I'd see. We've had, for example, Jewish people in New York City and protesting and sitting in Grand Central Station, occupying. We've had people of all different colours and religion and faith joining hands, linking arms, protesting against the awful and disgraceful actions of the Israeli government. So if there is one kind of kernel of hope, is that the world has woken up to the historic injustice that the Palestinian people have faced, not since October the 7th, but actually since their lands got occupied in 1948. They were forced off their lands like my wife's grandmother was in 1948. So look, I don't think people take it seriously. The problem is the ones who do take it seriously, like, for example, the administration in the United States and indeed the United Kingdom and many other governments across Europe, who continue to supply arms, funding, and give support to Israel. They are the ones that have the power and the leverage to do something about it.
What's your message to them?
My message is to find your humanity. You don't have to care about the geopolitics of the situation, but I question your humanity when you look at the images of dead children limp in their parents' arms being rushed to hospital, and put yourself in those shoes. What would you do if that was your son or your daughter, your nephew, your niece, your grandchild that was dying in your arms? And that's happened to at least 18,000 children in Gaza. So my message is pretty simple. Where is your humanity?
What do you think is stopping these world leaders from, they talk a lot about human rights and international law. What do you think is stopping them, or why is even Labour and the Conservative parties, both of them, they're very reluctant to call out Israeli war crimes? And just a few days ago, David Lammy, he said that Israel was in breach of international law by blockading Gaza. Very quickly, Number 10 backtracked on that. Why do you think that is? Why do you think our leaders are so scared to call out Israel?
First of all, David Lammy, somebody, by the way, who I've admired over the years, particularly when he was in opposition. And I was pleased when he's appointed as Foreign Secretary, because he's been somebody who's spoken powerfully about many issues over the years that I've long admired. He is somebody who reached out to me when my in-laws were in Gaza, for example. Personally reached out to me, which I was very grateful for. But I have to say I'm extraordinarily disappointed in his inability to be robust in the same way he is against Russia, which I commend, but be robust against the Israeli regime.
Yeah. When he reached out to you, he wasn't in office, was he? And now he's Foreign Secretary.
And don't get me wrong, I completely understand that when you're in office, I'm not expecting him to be a megaphone diplomat or a megaphone politician. You know, that's not what I expect from my Foreign Secretary. What I do expect, though, is real clarity. And he provides that clarity when it comes to Russia. Russia, who've annexed land, who've killed civilians, who've waged a war of aggression. Where's that same clarity when it comes to children being slaughtered on a mass scale? When it comes to UN facilities being bombed, when it comes to hospitals being bombed, when it comes to upholding international law? I'm not asking you to take a position. If you don't want to take a position, that's fine. How on earth you can't take a position as such slaughter, I don't know. But if you don't want to take a position, fine. At the very least, align yourself with international law. And that there takes me to your first question. Well, why are they not speaking out? It's very simple. I'm afraid that the honest truth is that Muslim lives and Arab lives, Palestinian lives, simply do not matter. Their blood is cheap, because if this was happening to blue-eyed, blonde-haired Europeans at this scale, there wouldn't only be sanctions, but those arrest warrants would have been enforced within 24 hours, and the leaders would be on trial in The Hague, and again would probably be locked up in a jail cell, never see the light of day again.
Do you think racism is behind this as well?
Of course it is. I'm afraid there's no other way of putting it. And it's blatant. Never in my life have I seen such naked hypocrisy and blatant racism in foreign policy, because as I say, if 18,000 blue-eyed, blonde-haired, Judeo-Christian children were being slaughtered in the way that Gazans have been slaughtered and are being slaughtered, then the world reaction would be far greater, far swifter. We certainly wouldn't be supplying arms to the aggressor, let alone billions of US dollars to fund the aggressor in that sense. And I believe in the equal application of international law. I support the ICC arrest warrants on Hamas individuals for a barbaric attack on the 7th of October. No equivocation. There's no justification for kidnapping children like Kiffer and Ariel Bibas. No justification. And that's somebody who's extremely sympathetic to the struggles of the Palestinian people. So I believe in equal application of international law against non-state parties like Hamas, but also state parties like the Israeli government. It's a shame that so much of Europe and the Western world can't show such clear moral clarity.
You've been very vocal. You've been one of the very few Western leaders who have been so vocal about Palestinian rights. What has been some of the backlash you've received because of that? Have you been called anti-Semitic for, criticizing Israeli policies? Has people tried to silence you?
I think the real shame in all of this is from somebody who's spent his life tackling all forms of hatred, including anti-Semitism, standing shoulder to shoulder with Jewish friends in the fight against hatred, including, as I say, anti-Semitism, that the fact that anybody who criticises the Israeli government's actions gets labelled anti-Semitic by certain quarters, like the Jewish Chronicle, for example, has just cheapened the real cause of anti-Semitism. Because anti-Semitism absolutely exists. And there are some people who will use certain causes to justify that anti-Semitism. But saying that all those millions of people across the world, if not billions of people, who support Palestinian rights, who are horrified at the killing of children by the Israeli government are anti-Semites, I'm afraid nobody believes that form of argument anymore. In terms of silence, there's always a backlash. I don't really care about the backlash. I don't care what people who try to silence me or call me names, give me abuse, harassment. I don't care one jot, because the future generations, our children and their children, will study what happened in terms of the terrible atrocities of October 7th and then the awful, barbaric retaliation thereafter. And they will ask each and every single one of us, particularly those who had any political influence whatsoever. What did you do? What did you say? And I want to be able to at least have a clear conscience and say that I did whatever I could in my power. It wasn't enough, because people are still suffering. But at least I was able to use the platform I've got to raise my voice.
Western leaders we've seen, they're apathetic. They're, too reluctant to put any force or any actual meaningful pressure on Israel to stop the conflict. But what about Muslim nations or Arab countries? Why haven't they united or used their vast oil wealth or the influence to try to stop, to put a stop to the war in Gaza?
Well, look, I'd be careful about kind of trying to, tar would be the same brush almost, and trying to ban all the Arab nations. One, I mean, I would commend, for example, at least the efforts of the government of Qatar, who have been deeply ingrained in leading the negotiation effort, and they've been doing that with real difficulty from the Israeli side in particular. But they've really used whatever influence they've got as a very small nation to try to see if they can broker some sort of peace, and they've done that alongside obviously partners in Egypt and the United States. If there was one positive to come out of the Trump administration, it's probably that it's given some people the kick up the backside they need. So when he came out with his lurid Gaza plan, which is ethnic cleansing by any other name, it probably sent alarm bells ringing in the heads of the Arab leaders that forced them to then get together and come forward with this Arab plan for Gaza, which, by the way, I have to say, having read the detail of it, looks like a good starter for a plan. There's some gaps in the issues that aren't addressed, but it is a good plan in terms of reconstruction for Gaza and possible political control over Gaza by Palestinian technocrats. I think it's a good plan. That they might not have bothered coming forward with that plan if it hadn't been for the fact that the alternative was so awful. So look, there's a lot more that Arab Muslim countries can and should do, but I don't think it should be just their responsibility. I think it's a responsibility for the entire international community.
Sure. Speaking of Trump, how are you viewing this situation in America? Trump is upending international relations. There's a tech billionaire who's seemingly running things behind the scenes. Where do you think America's headed under Trump?
Well, what a question. So let's try to dissect it if we can. So with Donald Trump, we've got somebody who's shown real sympathies to white supremacist movements. So one of his first actions was to pardon the leader of Proud Boys. Proud Boys, an ethno-nationalist white supremacist movement, unapologetically so, proudly white supremacist movement. So there's no doubts about where Donald Trump's sympathies lie, and he's never hidden them, in fairness to him. So let's just call a spade a spade. And I go back to what I said previously, the worry about the Trump administration is for somebody who talks a lot about free speech. It seems to me that they're determined to curtail free speech at every opportunity. And all of this driven by the tech bro in chief, the world's wealthiest man, Elon Musk, who bought his influence into the White House and is undoubtedly controlling the strings, the puppet master behind the president, and not hiding it, very open about what he's doing and how he's doing it.
What does that say about the state of democracy in America then?
It's deeply flawed, deeply flawed. When you look at the inauguration of Donald Trump, the front row, of course, which is usually reserved for cabinet members or potential cabinet members that will be confirmed by the Senate, instead was full of tech bros. You had them all lined up, all paying homage to Donald Trump, and actually also knowing that they're the ones that were in control. So we've got this dreadful situation where democracy can be bought and sold relatively cheaply. And Elon Musk donated $200 million in the grand scheme of things. Not a bad bargain if you can buy entire US democracy at that price. And using it for nefarious purposes, for really nefarious purposes. Elon Musk has aligned himself with the AfD in Germany, the far-right party. He's aligned himself with Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson is a man who called Islam a violent and fascist ideology. Aligned himself with far-right movements right across the world, and wants to overthrow the democratically elected Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So you've got real authoritarianism threatening to replace democracy in the United States, and that should worry every single one of us.
Do you ever feel that that kind of thing will come here to the UK?
Of course, we should all fear it. As I referenced already, the biggest threat, in my view, to Western liberal democracy is the rise of the far right, because the far right wants to get their tentacles into power and is authoritarianism. You either believe what they believe or they impose it upon you. And we can see that. I mean, free speech doesn't exist, in my view, in America, where the president can throw out news organizations like Associated Press on his press briefings. Of course, green card citizens, those that have got leave to remain in the United States, can then be detained in detention facilities and threatened with deportation. Why? Not because they've committed any crime. There's no crime being committed by Mahmoud Khalil. But he disagrees with US foreign policy. And that is the litmus test, where the Secretary of State can almost have carte blanche to throw people into a detention centre indefinitely. It's a really perilous state for democracy to be in.
What does that say about free speech when there's a lot of claims about America being a bastion of free speech, even American universities where they're trying to crack down on pro-Palestine protests, but someone like Mahmoud Khalil arrested for seemingly no reason? What does that say about the state of free speech there?
Well, I think it says that free speech is only available for those if your speech aligns with the government and the administration. So it's free speech if you believe in our speech. But if it's the wrong type of speech, it ain't free at all. And in fact, you could lose all of your rights and be deported from the country that you live in, the country that you have a legal right to be in. You can be kicked out. And it's a dreadful state of affairs, especially at a university, I have to say. It's even more galling. And we're in the wonderful city of Edinburgh, the home of the Enlightenment, where free speech, discourse that we disagree with, has been a real pillar of this city and this country. And yes, you have to have laws to protect people against speech that can cause them harm, like hate speech. I'm a supporter of that. I'm very proud to pass legislation to that effect here. But that doesn't curtail free speech. What is happening in the United States should worry every single person who believes in Western democracy, as I do.
Finally, moving on to Ukraine. It's been more than 3 years since Russia invaded. You tweeted last month that when it comes to Putin, appeasement is not an option. Why do you feel that negotiations or peace talks constitute appeasement? If not negotiations, what is your solution then to the crisis?
I don't think negotiations or peace talks are appeasement. I do think, though, that when Donald Trump berates the democratically elected leader of Ukraine, calling him a dictator, cutting off US intelligence to Ukraine, threatening to cut off military support to Ukraine, who again is the victim of the aggressor, then that to me is appeasement.
Okay.
Negotiations, by the way, diplomacy is the only way to stop conflict. There's very rarely a military solution to conflict. There can be in some occasions, but actually, although it looks like a victory in the first instance, it never leads to lasting peace, or very rarely leads to lasting peace. So I'm a great believer in negotiations and peace talks. I don't think, though, that should come at the entire expense of Ukraine's territorial sovereignty.
What do you think is going to happen with Ukraine? Like, Trump is trying to make a deal. Do you think peace is possible? Europe is really bolstering its defense. It's pummeling lots of money into its defense industries. What do you think the end result is going to be?
So you have Ukraine, who seem to be putting a lot on the table, not just their own natural resources and mineral resources, for which are being asset stripped from them, but also are being told that they have to give up any ambitions to be in NATO and possibly give up their territory that has been annexed unfairly. And so far, the only thing Russia seems to have agreed to is not to bomb power plants in Ukraine. But everything else seems to be allowed. So I'm pretty worried, I have to say, as a state. As somebody who wants to see peace, I don't want to see conflict. I believe in diplomacy, I believe in negotiations. I just worry when you have somebody like Vladimir Putin, who has been a ruthless leader, whether it's against the Chechens in his own country, whether it's been to neighbours like Ukraine. He's a bloodthirsty dictator. When you give him almost everything he needs, that to me seems like a green light for the actions that he's already committed.
Do you think Western leaders have done enough to create peace in Ukraine? Do you think there's been enough talks, enough diplomacy? Right now, Keir Starmer's announced, cuts to welfare services, cuts to the winter fuel allowance, lots of cuts. And yet the military keeps, and defense industries, and, that keeps increasing. Is that really in the best interests of the British people?
To take your first question, do I think Western leaders have done enough to bring peace to Ukraine and Russia? Absolutely not. No, there was an attempt to just completely isolate Russia, which again, I agreed with sanctions and so on and so forth, and sporting boycotts. For somebody who's got an ICC arrest warrant against them, I believe in the exact same thing for Israel, by the way. Israel has an ICC arrest warrant for war crimes and crimes against humanity against him. So they haven't done enough because there always has to be a back channel to discussions towards peace and negotiations. The same is true with the efforts that Qatar is doing with Israel and Hamas, and the same has to be true with Ukraine and Russia, but they haven't done enough. The question about defence, to me, is a complex one because, look, I believe that Europe has been far too reliant on the United States for its defence over the decades. So we have to become less reliant, particularly given the current erratic incumbent in the White House. And by the way, there's no guarantee that after 4 years, the person who replaces Trump, if Trump allows himself to be replaced, is any less erratic. They could be from the same movement, the MAGA movement, and could be, believe it or not, even more difficult to deal with, particularly from a European perspective. So Europe has to get serious about its defence. So spending more on defence actually is not something I'm intrinsically opposed to, because we have to be more reliant on ourselves in terms of self-defence. Though I entirely agree that the burden of that should not have fallen, for example, entirely on the overseas development aid budget. There's some excellent entrepreneurs and wealthy people like Dale Rintz who speak a lot about how they themselves are very wealthy but can contribute far more in their taxation. So there's better ways of, for example, whether it's filling a fiscal black hole, whether it's spending more on defence. The UK doesn't do nearly enough in terms of wealth taxes. And we have this huge gap between the wealthiest and the poorest in our country, getting bigger actually, according to the Financial Times, getting wider. But we're not targeting the most privileged and the wealthiest in our society, and the ones who are being targeted, the ones who are suffering, are the ones who can least afford.
Okay. Finally, there's numerous conflicts going on in the world. Like I said, defense budgets are increasing a lot. How fearful are you of a global war erupting or nuclear weapons being used?
It's a huge worry. I think it should worry us all. It's why I don't believe in any country continuing to have nuclear weapons. I believe in nuclear disarmament. I certainly believe in proliferation of nuclear weapons. And that's why my party's had a very strong stance against Trident for many, many years. It's a huge waste of money, but more importantly, it makes our world less safe, not more safe, in my view. So I've got a real worry about the state of the world. But at the same time, I refuse to be a fatalist. I'm somebody who genuinely has hope in the future. It's hard to see that hope at times, but I always am struck by the fact that there are more good people out there than bad. And if I just take a really small example that's very local to us, just not far from Edinburgh, we have a city in the northeast of Scotland, Aberdeen, and there was a horrible attack on a mosque in Aberdeen, paint thrown at the mosque, and a rock thrown through the window. And the wonderful thing though about that was that the local community were almost also picked up the cleaning tools and began to help to clean the paint off the mosques, then to help to repair the window that had been smashed. And to me, that was a great example, a small example, but a wonderful example that the voices of good will always outweigh the voices of bad. And that gives me hope.